Hello everyone, welcome back to Syntax Byte. It's Ryan, and in this video we're going to be showing you how to use the Google Cloud Translation API to create a Google Translate function in Excel VBA. So the Cloud Translation API is essentially the Google Translate API. It's something that allows you to use Google Translate and their translation technology in your own implementation. And today we're going to be using that to create a Google Translate function inside of Excel. So this is great if you need access to Google Translate in a brief, sort of Excel function. It'll work very similar to the function that's available in Google Sheets, but of course many people prefer Excel, and it's not too difficult to get this set up. I will say that one of the downsides of setting this up is that there's a couple things you have to install, which means that if you want to send this sheet to somebody else, you might want to copy and paste the translations rather than leaving the function in there. Just because the other person will have to do the setup on their system as well. So that is one of the downsides with it, but it works fairly well. The API is free for the first 500,000 characters per month. In English, I think we have about 5 characters per word, so that's probably about 100,000 words or so. But I guess then you have to include the spaces. Point is, it's not a terribly expensive API, but it is a mixed pricing model, and you do need to apply a credit card in order to get the API up and running. So just keep that in mind. It's free for the first 500,000 characters, which is applied as a $10 credit, and then after that it's $20 per million characters, and they do prorate that, so it's not like you're charged $20 as soon as you go over 500,000. It says here if you use 575, for instance, you're charged $1.50. So it's not too ridiculously priced. If you have a lot of translation need, you could end up tapping above the quota, but I think for a lot of people it would be below the quota. So to get started, there's a couple things we're going to have to do. The first thing I would recommend is setting up things in the Google Cloud Console. So what you're going to have to do to actually use this API is basically create a project. I have one created called Excel Macros. Then you want to enable the Google Cloud Translation service. So you go over to enabled APIs and services, and you can check if it's there. You can see mine is there for this project. But what you would do if it's not is you click enable APIs and services, search for it, and then enable it. Unfortunately, at that stage, you're not quite finished. You have to go over and create a credential. So what you want to do is you want to do create credentials. And then what you want to do, I believe, is do service account. And what you want to do is you basically want to give it a name. So G translate for Excel maybe. And you want to create and continue. I don't remember giving it a role, so we're just going to say done. So then under the service account, what you do is you add a new key pair. So you can go to add key and create new key. You can do JSON. And then the private key is saved to your computer. So that's basically what you're going to use to access the service. So there's a couple of other things that we need to set up. Basically, this key is going to be used to authenticate yourself with the Google Cloud API. In order to make that authentication easy, I would recommend installing the Google Cloud CLI, and we're going to call the G Cloud CLI from Excel using PowerShell in order to get our API key. Unfortunately, this isn't just a simple API key style thing. You need a service account to use the translation API, which is a bit clunky because you have to send a request using that G Cloud CLI to actually get the key, like the authentication token, and then you have to pass that token to the service. And I'm not sure how long the tokens last, but you definitely want Excel probably to be able to generate a token for someone who has valid credentials on their system. So in order to do that, what you do is you install the Google Cloud CLI. You can go here and install it for Windows. I've already got it installed. After, what you're going to do is you're going to do your gcloud init, and that will allow you to select basically the project that you're wanting to use. So with that out of the way, basically what you want to do is you can hop over into Excel, and we're going to start by getting the authorization token. So I've got my basic sheet here. I've got my phrase. These could all be different phrases, but I just have the same phrase, and I want to translate it into all of these languages. I ate breakfast at 8 in the morning, and I want my translated text to be here. So we're going to create that user-defined function shortly. The first thing I want to do is I want to insert a module. And inside of that module, the first thing I'm going to work on is just getting the auth token. So I'm going to create this as a sub, and then we're going to actually end up converting it to a function. But I want to test it, so it's just easier to run it as a sub to start with. So I'm going to start by doing set w shell is equal to create object w script dot shell. So this is going to allow us basically to run PowerShell from within Microsoft Excel, which is pretty neat. So I'm going to say set w shell exec is equal to w shell dot exec. I'm going to execute a command here, and basically I'm going to copy over the command here. What I want to do is I want to do this here. And so it's a double command. First, I am going to set an environment variable called Google Application Credentials, and that's going to be the path on my system where the credentials actually are. Now I've got to make sure I've got the name correctly. So this was my old one. I've got 2519. That's the same. But now I've got a new name. So I'm just going to copy the name of the file, and I'm going to paste it right here. And of course, you'll want to change your file to match whatever you've downloaded. And you can rename this file if you want. But just make sure that you know where it is on the system. You can also test this command out in PowerShell in advance. And that's how I sort of tested it. The other thing to keep in mind is that we've got an execution policy bypass on here. So when you're in PowerShell, you could change your execution policy. For some reason, it blocks gcloud CLI from running with the default policy, so you have to change it. But in this case, we're bypassing it just to run this particular command from Excel. That's the only way I've found to make it work when you're running it from Excel. And so after we've set that environment variable where the credentials are, of course, you may want to do something more advanced here and actually put that path on the sheet, particularly if you're going to send this to other people and they're going to need to enter their credentials. But for my case, I'm okay to have it hard-coded and then just change it in the code whenever I need. And then we're going to say gcloud auth application default print access token, and that's going to give us our access token. So at this point, all we have to do is we've called that CLI, which is going to take care of actually authenticating us with the Google Cloud API. We just need to get that key and save it. And so what I'm going to do up here is I'm going to do dim auth token as string, and I'm going to make that a global. And the reason I'm doing that is because we want to do this the first time that the function runs, but we don't want to necessarily get a new auth token every time the function runs, because we might run it multiple times in our sheet. So we don't have to send the request every time. We just want to send it the first time the function runs if we don't already have an auth token stored in memory. And then after that, we can store the auth token in memory and keep using that auth token for the remainder of the session. So at this point, I'm going to say output is equal to w shell exec dot standard out dot read all. Now something to note here, and we may have to troubleshoot, This is if there's a success. If there's an error, you need standard error to actually see what that is. Otherwise, standard out will be blank. So if you've ever coded in C, you know that there's standard out and standard error. And unfortunately, you do need to read them separately when you're reading this back in VBA, which is a little bit finicky. But once everything gets up and running, you don't really need to read the error. But if you're getting a blank result and you don't know why, try changing this to standard error and seeing what it does. So at this point, I'm just going to actually message box the output. We can use that global later. So I'm going to save it. I'm going to run it. You can see PowerShell opens up and it gives me that key. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we need to happen. That's the key that we need to authenticate with Google. So now that we've got that done, I'm going to convert this to a function. And rather than message box, I'm going to say get auth token equals output. So at this point, what we need to do is we need to create a function. This is our other user-defined function here, which is gTranslate. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it Google Translate if you want it to be the exact same name as the Google Sheets. You could just name it Translate. I'm calling mine gTranslate. The first parameter, I'm going to take text as string. This is the text we want to translate. I'm going to take target lang as string. This is the 2-letter code, which can be found on Google's website for the language that you want the text to be translated into. And then I'm going to take an optional source lang as string. So why this is optional is because with Google Translate, which is pretty cool, we can actually tap into that sort of detect language functionality that you see on the website. And so by default, if we just don't pass this, Google will detect whatever source language it thinks it is. But if you're getting funky results, we still can provide the option to provide a source lang. So you could just remove this if you wanted to always detect, or you could make it non-optional if you wanted to always specify, but this is giving us the full range of functionality by making that optional. So I'm going to add one other thing up here, which is just dim has attempted auth as boolean, which should be default false. Basically what that's going to do is if I have the function multiple times, I'm going to check if I have an auth token. If not, I'm going to try and get an auth token. If the auth token fails, I don't really want it to keep trying because that probably means something is wrong. Like the file isn't on my system anymore. Like it can't find the file. I don't have an internet connection. Something like that is going wrong. It's probably not going to not work once and then work for the rest of the file. So this just prevents it from continually trying every time, but you don't necessarily have to do that. So first I want to check if auth token is a blank string, and if so, I want to say if has attempted auth, then I'm going to say gTranslate is equal to NA. So we'll just throw back NA, not translatable, whatever, and then we'll exit function. And that way we don't continually try every time to get an auth token. If it's not working, we can try and figure out why and then restart Excel and we can give it another shot. But if we haven't attempted auth, we want to go ahead and try and get an auth token. Auth token equals get auth token, and has attempted auth equals true, so that we don't try that again, even if we lose our token for some reason or we didn't get one. So this is basically giving us that. We want to do an and if. And so great, we have an auth token. We can continue on with the rest of, actually translating the stuff, calling the API. So what we want to do is we want to do a set obj HTTP. You can call this whatever you want. This is what the guy in Stack Overflow called it. And we're going to create a new object of type msxml2.server XML HTTP. And what this is going to allow us to do is send a post request. Now, depending on how familiar you are, let's see if we can get over to the documentation here. With certain APIs, you may be probably more familiar with sending a GET request to make API calls, but in this particular case, we're going to want to send a post request. And a post request is just a different type of web request. If you look up the sort of HTTP protocol, there's a GET request, a POST request. There are others like update and delete, but GET and POST are kind of the two standard type of requests that you see the most often. And so that's what we're going to actually be doing here. A POST request is going to allow us to add some parameters that aren't part of the URL, but are part of our query. Now, I just want to find the documentation for this so I can show you where, the thing actually is. I find their documentation really weird. They have like these things like adding it to the Android app. I'm like, no, I just want to know how the API basically works. And so they show you here, basically you're going to send this type of thing over to the API, this JSON, and then we're going to get JSON back, and I'll show you how to parse that in Excel. That's no problem. It's going to fire us back this translated text. And that's basically how it's going to go. But we need a post request, and then we send this in the request body. So that's kind of how that goes. So we need to create that post request, and we're going to do that using this MS XML. So next I am going to do URL equals, and I am going to just copy and paste the URL. This is the API URL. And I've got a quote there. So that's the API URL. You can find that on Google's website, or I'll probably have a written tutorial down below if you want to just copy and paste that, or you want to copy and paste any of the other code, I don't mind. And obj http.open. We're going to open for a post request. We're going to open that with URL false, which I have no idea what does. And then we're going to do obj http.set request header authorization. This is how we're going to authorize ourselves with the API. And so we're going to pass bearer and then an auth token. So that's how we're actually going to authenticate with the API. So rather than some APIs you pass an API key as part of the URL, here we're just using that URL, we're sending it a post request, and we're going to use our authorization via our HTTP headers. Next, we need to build our actual request. We need to build up that JSON. Now, potentially you could use a JSON library to sort of build this. I'm just building it as a string because I think, there's a minimal amount of JSON and it's not really going to change. So I'm going to start off my request with my query. My query, or my queue, is my text that I want to translate. So I'm starting off with a basic object, queue. And then I need an open quote. I'm going to end quote and put my text in there. And then I'm going to end quote, and I'm going to put a comma. If you're unfamiliar with JSON, you can go look it up. It's basically just a special language for key value pairs. And that's what Google is going to understand when we send it to their API. We're going to send them this information via our post request, which is a special type of web request, just like can be made in your browser, but we're making that here in Excel to the API. And we're going to pass it this, and it's going to be able to parse this and pick out the different variables we're sending. So we need to send our text that's labeled queue. It's all part of this object, right, which is just a list of key value pairs. And everything, those values are separated with a comma, which is why we need the comma, and the values are encoded. We can do single quotes or double quotes, but it's a little bit easier to do single quotes for the JSON and double quotes for VBA, so that's how I'm doing that here. Now we want to check if we have that variable that we gave it. So we have source lang, which is an optional variable, source lang. And so if it's not equal to blank, then we want to put in the source lang. So we're going to say request equals request, and so we're going to add on to it, and source. And then we're going to put in and source lang. And then after that, we put the comma, and that's good. And we're going to do end if. So that part will only go into our request if we're specifying a source lang. If we're not specifying a source lang, no need to send Google a source lang. Just leave it blank, and Google will try and figure out what source lang we're talking about. It will go ahead and use that detect language functionality. Next, we need to finalize our request with our target language information. So we do request equals request, and now we're going to do target is equal to, and target. I call this target lang, right? Or did I just call it target? Target lang. And we need to add the quote on there. And then finally, we're passing format. Format is always going to be text, so I don't need to add a variable in there. I can just hard code that. It's always going to be text. And that's that. So perfect. That is our request. Now we want to send that request. So we do obj http.send request. Now we need to get the response and see what it looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say gtranslate. This is setting the return value for the function equals obj http dot response text. Now this is going to be in the JSON format. It's not going to be just the pure text. So we'll need to filter that out, and I'll show you how to do that as sort of the last part of this tutorial. But we can go ahead and see if it works. So let's go ahead here and say equals gtranslate, and you can see Excel autocompletes. I wish it would autocomplete the parameters too, but it doesn't. So you have to remember what they are, but it's just that one and then that one. And we're not going to specify a source. I'm going to hit enter. It's going to fetch our key, and then it's going to give us that translation. And because it's JSON, it's kind of, but you can see j'ai pris mon petit déjeuner à 8h du matin has been translated. So I ate my breakfast at 8 in the morning. J'ai pris mon petit déjeuner à 8h du matin. My French is a work in progress, but hopefully that's okay. That's the only one of these that I'm going to be able to pronounce with any sort of authenticity. But so now we need to pick out that translated text, and there's a special library called VBA JSON that's going to allow us to do just that. So what you do is you just download this library, and then you import it into your project, and you add a reference to Microsoft Scripting Runtime, and it's basically a one-liner, and we'll be finished with this particular function. So what we want to do now is we want to add that in. I've already downloaded it, but go ahead and download it from this. This link will be in the description. And then what you want to do is you want to do file, import file, and JSON converter.bas. From there, what we want to do is we want to say dim translate JSON as object and set. Remember, you have to use the set keyword with objects in VBA. We're going to do JSON converter.parse JSON, and we're going to send it that obj http.response text. At this point, we just pick it out of there. So it's basically just using a dictionary, and that reminds me, we need to add in the reference to the Microsoft Scripting Runtime. So go to Tools References and add in Microsoft Scripting Runtime. Hit OK. And do translate JSON. So inside of this, we still have our response, right? So we have an object that says data. Inside of that, we have another object, which is translation. Like data is an object. In there, there's another key called translations, which is an array. So we would just want to take the first one. You can pass multiple translations into the API, but we're only ever going to be passing one at a time. And so it's always going to be the first item, and then we want the translated text option. It does, you see, it passes the detected source language in there. It won't do that if we actually specified the source language, but we don't really have a way to return multiple values in Excel cleanly, so we're not gonna bother, unfortunately. So there's not necessarily a super easy way for the user to see if it's wrong without having some sort of basic familiarity with the language that they're translating to, but that's okay. When in doubt, they can always specify the source language. So we're going to do translate JSON, and we need data, that data object. We need translations. From the data object, we want the first object, and we want the translated text. And we'll save that. We'll go ahead and re-enter this one. Perfect. Interestingly, it did re-grab the auth token there, but it did go ahead and translate it. So now what I'm going to do is, you'll notice that I can also specify en, and it's happy. And you can see that time it didn't grab the token, so I guess it just lost it from memory, but that's not a big deal when we edited the file. And I can go ahead and drag this down, and we will see it is making web requests in the background. So it does take a second. It's not going to be necessarily instant, but you can see it was fairly quick. And we have translations into a wide variety of languages. So that is how you can use Google Translate in Excel VBA. It's a bit of a setup process with just installing the CLI, making sure that you have the credentials sort of set up. But once you get that done, it's quite functional, and the VBA itself is really not too bad. It's a little bit of interfacing with PowerShell, which was a new experience for me, but it works fairly well to take advantage of another program already on the system. And then it's just a simple post web request and some JSON parsing, which are all made very easy with the libraries available to you in VBA. So unfortunately it doesn't count lines for me, but I'd say, I don't know, maybe, it can tell me if I'm in about 50 lines of VBA. We've got a fully functional Google Translate function that can detect the language and translate into any language which Google can translate into. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Hopefully it wasn't too long, and hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. I do try to respond if I know the answer. I'm not a wizard, but I am relatively familiar with VBA. So if there's something going on, please provide me as much detail as possible, and I will try and get back to you. If you like the video, please give it a like. If you want to see more content like this, please hit the subscribe button, and you can even hit the bell for those notifications. And I will see you in the next video.